Sarah was driving alone on Interstate 70 through the barren stretch of Kansas on her way back from her sister's wedding in Denver when she noticed the headlights in her rearview mirror. The highway was almost deserted at this hour, with the exception of the occasional trucker, and at first, she didn't think much of the few other late-night drivers cutting through the darkness because cars were constantly passing each other on the interstate. However, as the minutes passed, those headlights continued to be there behind her, keeping the exact same distance. When she slowed down, they slowed down, and when she sped up a little, they matched her speed precisely. Sarah's hands tightened. It was probably just another driver traveling in the same direction, perhaps using her taillights as a guide through the boring Kansas landscape. But something felt off deep down. Sarah told herself she was being paranoid while driving, but she had no idea that she had become the latest target of someone the FBI would later identify as one of America's most prolific highway for more than 3 years. Stalkers have been using the interstate system to target lone drivers, especially women who are traveling alone at night. His approach is always the same: observe drivers from a distance, observe their patterns, and wait for the ideal opportunity to attack. This case has baffled law enforcement on several occasions. State victims claim to have been followed for hundreds of kilometers, occasionally even across state lines. The stalkers appear to have a remarkable ability to blend in with everyday traffic, taking advantage of the highway's anonymity to drive various vehicles, always taking them, always using phony license plates. But his signature was Sarah tried to ignore her growing uneasiness. But when she took the exit for a rest stop near Salina, the headlights followed and her heart started racing. The rest area was dark and almost empty, with only a few semi-trucks parked in the far corner. He was consistent, spending hours following his targets to learn about their habits, routes, and vulnerabilities. Sarah sat in her car, engine running, trying to decide what to do. She could see the dark silhouette of the other vehicle in her mirrors, but she couldn't make out any details about the driver. Her phone only displayed two bars of information. She had hoped that the stalker would continue down the highway, but instead the car pulled into a space several rows behind her and turned off its lights. Signal, but she was able to dial 911. The dispatcher instructed her to remain in her locked car and said that a patrol car would arrive at her location, but it would take at least 20 minutes. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, Sarah noticed a figure emerge from the other car in the Sarah, saw a tall man in dark clothes walking slowly toward the building in the dim light of the rest area. He didn't look at her, but there was something purposeful and calculated about his movements. Sarah made the snap decision to put her car in reverse and pull out of the parking spot, her tires squealing on the asphalt, instead of waiting to see if the man would react. She jumped off the accelerator and merged back onto the interstate, her heart thumping so loudly that she could hear it over the noise of the engines for the next 50 kilometers. Her rearview mirror was still clear, and she thought she had gotten away. But then she saw those same headlights coming quickly in the distance. Sarah pushed her sedan to its breaking point as the stalker got back into his car and began pursuing her. It was a terrifying game of cat and mouse on the dark Kansas highway. But the pursuing car was stronger and would get closer until it was only a few meters behind her, its high beams soaking her. The stalker was using a methodical and cruel psychological torture technique that investigators would later discover he had perfected over dozens of prior incidents. He would alternate between aggressive pursuit and calculated distance, wearing down his victims' nerves and making them feel extremely afraid. The stalker would flash a car with blinding light and then abruptly fall back. Sarah's phone kept losing signal in the rural areas, cutting off her calls to 911. She felt completely alone on the empty highway with no way to call for help and nowhere to hide. Every small town they passed was dark and closed for the day. This forced them to make bad decisions. Several of his previous victims had crashed their vehicles while attempting to escape, making them easy prey. After an hour of this terrifying chase, Sarah noticed the lights of Topeka in the distance. She had never been happier to see the glow of a city before. As she entered the more populated area, she noticed more traffic on the road, and the stalker's behavior changed. He fell back further. At night, gas stations were closed, and even the truck stops seemed deserted. Keeping a more covert distance, Sarah drove straight to a police station she saw on her GPS after taking the first exit she saw. Her hands were shaking so much that she could hardly turn off the engine as the stalker's car drove by without stopping, vanishing into the night. The FBI's behavioral analysis unit concluded that the highway stalker was an organized predator who used the interstate system, and police took her report seriously. They had been monitoring similar incidents throughout the Midwest 4 months, and Sarah's thorough account of the pursuit fit the pattern they had been looking into. Her case became a key piece of evidence in what would ultimately turn into a multi-state manhunt. 3 weeks after Sarah's encounter, the stalker committed a deadly error when he pursued a woman named Jennifer Martinez along Interstate 35. He used this as his hunting ground, studying his victims' behavior to learn about their weaknesses and fears before making his move. The psychological terror he inflicted was just as much a part of his strategy as the physical threat. Instead of panicking, Jennifer, an off-duty police officer with training in defensive driving and evasive tactics, used her radio to coordinate with local law enforcement, guiding the stalker into a meticulously planned trap before they apprehended him at a roadblock close to Oklahoma City. Investigators discovered an unsettling collection of evidence in his car, including notebooks with notes about his victims' routines and vulnerabilities, detailed maps of interstate rest stops and remote highway sections, and photographs of dozens of different women taken from a distance. During questioning, the suspect disclosed the terrifying scope of his operation. For more than 3 years, he had been stalking drivers, mostly women who were traveling alone at night. He claimed to have followed over 60 victims, observing their behavior and taking advantage of their fear. The majority of his victims were unaware that they were being stalked until it was too late. For the investigation showed that his actions may have been linked to a number of missing persons cases along the interstate corridors. Women who had simply disappeared during lengthy drives had their cars discovered abandoned on isolated highways with no sign of what had happened to them. Sarah's quick thinking and refusal to panic had probably saved her life. Investigators told her, despite the technical challenges, the case demonstrated the vulnerability of lone drivers on America's extensive highway system, where predators can operate across state lines and blend into the anonymous flow. Everything was done correctly, including avoiding isolated stops and staying in populated areas whenever possible. Of traffic, the FBI released new nighttime driving safety guidelines that emphasize the need to pay attention to your surroundings and follow your gut when something feels off. For Sarah, the experience permanently altered her perspective of the open road. She never again drove long distances by herself at night, and she couldn't get rid of the image of those headlights following her in her mirror. The highway stalker was ultimately found guilty on several federal charges and given a life sentence, but his case introduced investigators to a predatory behavior they had never completely comprehended, using the interstate system in the United States as a hunting ground. He stalked through the Kansas night with patient predatory intent. The vanishing town of Route 50 Mark had been driving for 14 hours straight when he first noticed the exit sign for Millbrook. The green highway marker appeared in his headlights like a mirage, and after 2 miles, he rubbed his eyes. This is where anonymity and isolation create the ideal conditions for fear too. He was positive that he was seeing things because his GPS indicated that there shouldn't be any settlements. For another 30 meters along this barren section of Route 50 in Nevada, the time was 2:17 a.m. as Mark and I were completing the last portion of his cross-country journey from Chicago to Los Angeles. He had been the coffee from his last stop had long since worn off, and he knew he needed to rest before he became a danger to himself and other drivers. He had been fighting exhaustion for the past hour, his eyelids getting heavy as the endless desert highway stretched before him. The exit ramp appeared exactly where the sign had promised, and Mark took it without hesitation. As he descended the off-ramp, he noticed something strange. There were no lights visible in the distance where the town should be, no glow on the horizon, no street lamps, just darkness. He was thankful for any chance to find a place to sleep for a few hours, but as he reached the bottom of the ramp, street lights abruptly flickered on. He felt a wave of relief as he saw a small motel with a vacancy sign glowing red in the night, a diner with warm light spilling from its windows, and a gas station with its neon sign buzzing softly, all of which were shining on a perfectly normal-looking, small-town main street. The scientific community has documented dozens of similar incidents over the past 50 years, especially along desert highways where extreme fatigue, sleep deprivation, and environmental factors can create highway mirages. Mark was unaware that he had stumbled into one of America's most documented but least understood phenomena. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a neurologist who was researching sleep disorders in long-distance truck drivers, first formally documented the phenomenon. In 1967, she had gathered testimonies from more than 200 drivers who claimed to have seen towns, rest stops, or gas stations that weren't on any map. These drivers' experiences were remarkably consistent, and drivers would be extremely exhausted from driving alone through remote areas at night. And when they came across what seemed to be a fully operational town or facility, Mark pulled into the motel parking lot and sat in his car for a while, trying to get his head straight. He felt that something about the place seemed a little strange, but he couldn't place it. He entered the motel office and was greeted by a friendly, middle-aged clerk who seemed normal enough, asking the standard questions about Mark's stay, including how long he would be staying and whether he needed a wake-up call. The buildings looked real enough, but there was a strange quality to the light, as if everything was slightly out of focus around the edges. With the exception of one detail that Mark would only recall later, the interaction felt completely normal. The clerk never looked directly at Mark, instead appearing to focus on something to the left of his face. The room was tidy and comfortable, with all the usual amenities. Mark fell onto the bed, fully clothed, too tired to even take off his shoes, and he set his phone alarm, 4:06 in the morning. According to sleep specialists who have examined these cases, the human brain's capacity to produce realistic sensory experiences amid extreme exhaustion is significantly more potent than most people believe. I dropped into a deep sleep within minutes. The brain essentially creates a waking dream state where the driver experiences a fully interactive environment that feels completely real, according to Michael Rodriguez, who published a groundbreaking study on highway hallucinations in 2019. Mark woke up to sunlight streaming through the curtains of his motel room, and his phone indicated 8:23 a.m. As he grabbed his possessions, he noticed something odd. His phone displayed no service bars. When he tried to verify, he discovered that his alarm hadn't gone off, and he felt refreshed for the first time in days, albeit a little lost about where he was. His GPS failed to locate him, so he went outside to his car with the intention of getting breakfast at the diner before returning to the highway. However, as soon as he entered the parking lot, the warm morning light showed that he was standing in the middle of an empty field with only scrub brush and desert as his surroundings. He remembered the town so clearly that he could even see his tire tracks in the dust, indicating where he had pulled off the highway and parked the psychological test. As far as he could see, Mark's car was parked on a dirt pull-off next to Route 50, exactly where he had apparently stopped during the night. His luggage was still in the back seat, and his keys were in his pocket. Dr. Chen's research revealed that the hallucinations were so detailed and convincing that subjects frequently refused to believe they weren't real even when presented with evidence to the contrary. The impact of these experiences can be profound. Many drivers report feeling intense confusion and self-doubt, questioning their own memories and sanity. After 20 minutes of searching for any indication of the buildings he had seen, Mark discovered nothing but barren desert. His phone finally received a signal, and his GPS pinpointed his precise location, a rest area that had been closed and demolished 15 years prior. The closest town was still 30 miles away as he stood. In the dust next to his car, Mark saw footprints that made his blood run cold. These were not just his own footprints from walking around the area, but also another set of footprints that were bleeding from his car to a location about 20 feet away and back again. The prints were clear and recent, having been made sometime during the footprints on the night belonged to a person wearing size 11 or 12 work boots, and they repeatedly circled Mark's car as though someone had been looking at it while he slept. But that was not possible because Mark had slept in a motel room. The highway patrol officers who respond to these incidents have established procedures for handling drivers who are confused. The phenomenon is well known among law enforcement, and officers are trained to be supportive rather than dismissive. Mark called 911 not because he was in a phantom town. Officer Janet Walsh, who has worked Route 50 for more than 20 years, estimates she encounters at least a dozen such cases annually. "You're not the first person to call me from this exact spot," she told Mark, "because this old rest area has been attracting confused drivers for years." The highway patrol officer who responded was surprisingly understanding because he needed to report what he believed might have been a break-in attempt. According to her, something about this place seems to trigger these experiences in people who are severely sleep-deprived. She clarified that when the human brain is overworked, it can produce extremely detailed hallucinations that include familiar elements like the motel and diners. The experience feels real because the brain experiencing it believes that the mysterious footprints were made by Mark himself while he was confused, even though he didn't remember leaving his car. Walsh showed Mark a folder of files she kept in her patrol car that were filled with similar accounts from other drivers, revealed that tired travelers would leave here thinking they had discovered a town that had everything they needed, only to awaken in the desert alone. Dr. Rodriguez's research indicates that these hallucinations have a protective purpose, with the brain realizing that in Mark's case, his brain had given him a safe place to sleep, preventing what could have been a fatal accident. The most unnerving part of these incidents isn't the hallucination itself. When a driver is tired, it basically forces them to stop by creating a convincing scenario that meets their immediate needs. However, Mark's recollections of the motel, room's carpet texture, the taste of the water from the bathroom tap, and even the sound of the ice maker in the hallway are so detailed and consistent that they felt as real as any other experience in his life. Though the experience haunted him, Mark eventually continued his journey to Los Angeles. He conducted extensive research on the phenomenon and found dozens of similar accounts from other drivers, some of whom described elaborate meals at diners that didn't exist, while others reported entire conversations with phantom gas station attendants. The incident altered Mark's perspective on long-distance driving forever. He learned to identify the early warning signs of dangerous fatigue and to stop at actual, verified locations before his brain felt the need to create its own. But he never forgot the vivid reality of that night in Millbrook, a town that existed only in the desert. Extreme exhaustion and isolation on desert highways were a common theme. Years later, when Mark posted his story online, dozens of other drivers who had encountered similar situations got in touch with him. They created an unofficial network, sharing their stories and alerting others to the risks of driving while extremely tired. Reminder that when the human mind is overworked, it can produce realities that seem more real than the actual world. 3. The radio signals of Highway 95. Jessica was listening to static 143 when she heard the voice. Her radio had been picking up only white noise for the last 50 meters as she drove north on Highway 95 through the Nevada desert for the previous 3 hours. So when a distinct human voice broke through the static, "This is emergency frequency for 162. Anyone listening?" she almost leapt out of her seat. 675 at mile marker 127 on Highway 95. "We urgently need assistance." When she saw that someone was in trouble and calling for help, Jessica's medical training kicked in, and she grabbed her phone to call 911, but the screen showed no signal. She was in one of those dead zones that plagued the remote stretches of Nevada's highways, and her hands tightened on the steering wheel. She drove back to Portland after visiting her elderly father in Las Vegas. Clearer, now with an edge of panic, the voice went on. "Our vehicle broke down about 2 hours ago, and we have elderly passengers, one of whom is not doing well. The temperature is dropping quickly out here. If anyone can hear this, please send help to mile marker 127 on Highway 95. When Jessica looked at her GPS, she saw that she was getting close to mile marker 115, which indicated that the stranded drivers were only 12 miles ahead of her. She could arrive there in less than 10 minutes, so she driven harder, putting her nursing instincts ahead of any worries about driving alone at night in the desert. However, Jessica was unaware that she was the combination of atmospheric conditions, mineral deposits, and geographical features can occasionally cause radio signals to bounce and reflect in ways that defy conventional wisdom, a phenomenon that has baffled scientists and engineers for decades. Anomalous radio propagation in desert environments. Knowledge of how radio waves work. Between 1951 and 1992, hundreds of nuclear weapons tests were conducted at the Nevada test site, which is close to Highway 95. The powerful electromagnetic pulses from these explosions caused long-lasting alterations to the local geology and atmosphere. As Jessica drove through the darkness, the voice on the radio grew more frantic. "If anyone is listening, please, we really need help. We have an elderly woman here who's in need of assistance." Dr. Richard Yamamoto, an atmospheric physicist who studied the area in the 1980s, documented numerous cases of radio anomalies that couldn't be explained by conventional science. "Having chest pains, we are unable to receive a mobile signal, and nobody has stopped to assist us. We are becoming really frightened." Jessica's heart is racing. She worked as a cardiac nurse, and since chest pains in an older patient constituted a critical emergency, she attempted to broadcast on the same frequency on her radio. "I'm on my way to your place, and should arrive in about 5 minutes. Could you please provide me with more information about the patient's condition?" There was a burst of static, and then the voice came back. "Thank God someone heard us, because she's conscious but very pale, and she's complaining of chest pain and shortness of breath. We don't have any medical supplies with us." So Jessica had mile marker 125 appeared in her headlights, then 126, and Jessica slowed down, scanning both sides. She had mentally catalogued what she could do to help, and once she got there, she told the caller to keep the patient calm, sit up straight, and loosen any tight clothing. The voice thanked her repeatedly, and she could hear the relief in the person's tone. By now, she should be able to see the hazard lights of any stranded vehicles on the highway, but the road ahead was pitch black. As mile marker 127 passed, Jessica pulled over, switched on her hazard lights, and took a flashlight out of her glove box. She then proceeded along the highway's shoulder, calling out into the darkness, but all she could hear was, "This is Jessica. I'm at mile marker 127, but I can't see you. Could you flash your lights or honk your horn so I can find you?" The wind was whistling through the desert scrub, so she went back to her car and tried the radio again. The voice came back, but it was faint. "We can see your lights, and we're right here on the shoulder. Can you see us?" Jessica searched the desert frantically, finding nothing in every direction. She continued walking along the shoulder, shining her flashlight into the darkness, but she saw no cars, no people, and no tire tracks in the sand next to the road. The phenomenon Jessica was experiencing has been recorded by the due to temperature, inversions, variations in atmospheric pressure, and the distinct mineral composition of Nevada's desert floor. Radio waves can bend and reflect in ways that make signals from far-off sources appear to be coming from nearby locations. This phenomenon has been known since the 1960s by the Federal Communications Commission. According to Dr. Yamamoto's research, some of these unusual signals seem to be echoes from previous broadcasts that had been somehow recorded and were being played back years or even decades later. He claimed that the electromagnetic disturbances brought about by the nuclear testing program had produced what he called atmospheric recording devices, which could capture and replay radio broadcasts. Under particular circumstances, Jessica tried the radio once more. "I apologize for not seeing you. Are you certain you're mile marker 127? Perhaps you misread the sign." The voice returned right away. "So yes, we are here. Please don't leave us. The elderly woman is becoming worse, and we truly need assistance." From Jessica's medical training, informed her of the seriousness of the situation, but she could see that no one was there. She spent 20 minutes walking down the highway, looking in every potential spot where a car might have broken down, but all she saw was empty desert. Desperate, she tried a different strategy. "What kind of vehicle are you?" the voice said. "It's a blue station wagon. What color is it?" "We're a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 elderly passengers, and it's a 197 Oldsmobile. We're heading to Reno for a family reunion." Jessica, who was an amateur radio enthusiast and had spent years listening to emergency channels, felt cold for reasons unrelated to the desert night air. Something about the voice she tried again, but the terminology they used felt incorrect and sounded like it was from a different era. There was a long delay, and then it was September 15th, 1987. Why are you saying that Jessica's blood ran cold when it was October? According to Dr. Yamamoto's classified research, which was declassified in 2019, the voice on the radio in 2024 claimed to be from 37 years ago. The Nevada test site had captured multiple instances of what appeared to be temporal radio echoes, which were radio transmissions that seemed to be from the past replaying under particular atmospheric conditions. The theory was that as Jessica sat in her car, staring at the empty highway, she realized that she might be hearing an echo of a real emergency that had happened decades ago. The intense electromagnetic pulses from nuclear testing had caused distortions in the local spacetime continuum that could trap and replay radio signals. In September 1987, a family in a blue station wagon was stranded somewhere in the Nevada desert with a sick elderly woman who called for help but never received it. When she got to a self-service area, she attempted to look up the incident on her phone but was unable to locate any records of missing people or stranded drivers that fit the description. After learning that Highway 95 was well known among radio enthusiasts for these kinds of unusual transmissions, Jessica discovered that the family's fate was still unknown. The road between Yucca Mountain and the Nevada test site had been the focus of multiple studies by government scientists, but the majority of their findings, the phenomenon was well documented but poorly understood, serving as a reminder that the desert held secrets that science couldn't fully explain. Other drivers had also reported similar experiences, including voices calling for help that could never be located, radio transmissions that appeared to be from different time periods, and conversations with people who couldn't possibly be there. Although Jessica never again drove Highway 95 at night, she occasionally heard faint voices in the static on her home radio, pleading for help that would never arrive in the desert. It appeared that the ghosts of the past had a long memory and were still attempting to contact the living. The official explanation from the Jessica realized that what she had witnessed was something much more enigmatic and unnerving than the FCC, which was atmospheric anomalies and signal propagation effects. Somewhere in the electromagnetic spectrum, imprisoned between the radio waves and the desert night, the past was still wailing for assistance. For the fog banks of Interstate 80, David had been driving through clear mountain air just moments before. But now he was facing what he had seen when he crested the hill near Donner Pass. The fog wall stretched across Interstate 80 like a solid, grey curtain, completely blocking his view of the road ahead. It was 3:22 a.m. and seemed as an impenetrable wall of mist that rose from the asphalt and vanished into the blackness above it. David had driven this car on a Tuesday in November, while traveling late from Sacramento to Reno for an early morning business meeting. The fog bank had distinct edges, as if someone had drawn a line across the highway where visibility just ended. David slowed his sedan to a crawl as he approached the wall of mist, even though he had driven the route dozens of times and knew that fog could roll in quickly in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Even with his high beams, he could hardly see the yellow lines on the road because the headlights seemed to be absorbed by the fog rather than penetrate it, creating an eerie glow that illuminated nothing. The temperature gauge on his dashboard indicated that the outside air had dropped 15 in a matter of minutes, was experiencing what meteorologists refer to as advection fog, but the unique circumstances surrounding Donner Pass produced variations that went against the norm. Dr. Sandra Morrison, an atmospheric scientist who worked for the National Weather Service and studied Sierra Nevada weather systems, had recorded dozens of instances where fog the region's distinct topography and temperature differences between the valleys and peaks could produce what Morrison called supernatural fog events, which were fog banks that formed suddenly and without warning, maintained perfect geometric shapes, and produced fog formations that behaved in ways that defied accepted meteorological principles. When temperature inversions were most likely to occur in the late fall and early winter months. When David's car entered the fog bank, his entire world vanished and his visibility dropped to less than 3 feet in all directions. He could hardly see his own hood, let alone the road ahead. Microclimates with their own weather systems, he tried to follow the yellow center line, but it kept vanishing and resurfacing in the mist several times, and he found himself drifting. The speedometer indicated that he was moving at a walking pace, but even that felt dangerously fast in these conditions. The fog seemed to muffle all sound, creating an unnatural silence broken only by the hum of his engine. After driving what seemed like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, David realized something was wrong. He was heading toward what he thought was the shoulder, only to change course when he saw the lane markers. The fog had an odd quality to it, seeming to swirl and move with a purpose that natural fog shouldn't have. His position on the map appeared to be bouncing around randomly, and his GPS indicated that he should have been about 10 miles through the fog bank by now. However, the display indicated that he had barely moved at all, with the satellite signal intermittently cutting in and out. Morrison's research had found multiple instances where drivers were trapped in these fog systems for hours, driving in circles on roads. Their GPS systems and cell phones malfunctioned within the fog banks, leaving drivers completely disoriented. David attempted to call for assistance, but his phone showed no signal, and the radio seemed to create its own gravitational pull, drawing cars back into its center, no matter which way they tried to drive. The most unnerving part was the silence David experienced. His fuel gauge indicated that he had started with a full tank, but the needle was dropping more quickly than it should have, as if the car was exerting more effort to maintain speed in the dense air. He was totally cut off from the outside world and alone in a moving grey void that seemed to go on forever. Even at this hour, there should have been some traffic trucks making overnight deliveries, other travelers, or someone else, but the fog seemed to have swallowed up every other indication of human activity. As he continued his slow progress through the mist, David realized he hadn't seen or heard another vehicle since entering the fog bank on a major interstate highway. observe odd lights in the fog surrounding him. They weren't the recognizable red and white lights of other cars, but rather gentle blue-green radiances that appeared to dance and flicker just out of his line of sight. When he attempted to concentrate on them directly, they would vanish and then reappear in his peripheral vision a short while later. This was all part of Dr. Morrison's classified research. Similar light phenomena within these fog banks had been documented in collaboration with the Federal Aviation Administration. The lights seemed to be an electrical discharge produced by the special atmospheric conditions, akin to ball lightning, but more persistent and stable. Pilots had reported that these lights interfered with aircraft instruments and created hazardous navigation hazards. Suddenly, David's car radio, the signal was crystal clear, even though all other frequencies had been producing nothing but static. Tommy Dorsey and his orchestra were playing a swing tune he didn't recognize, followed by an announcer's voice with the characteristic cadence of old-time radio. The signal crackled to life, picking up what sounded like music from the 1940s. It's a gorgeous November evening in 1943. Live from the Trianon Ballroom in Chicago. And we'll be back with more music. After this announcement from our sponsor, David looked at his radio in shock, as the broadcast sounded utterly real, not like a nostalgic recreation or historical recording. The audio quality was too perfect for a temporal radio propagation, was one of Morrison's most controversial findings. Under certain atmospheric conditions, fog banks appeared to act as conduits for radio signals from different times. The transmission was from the 1940s, but it was too period accurate to be modern. He tried switching stations, but every frequency now carried similar programming from decades past. During certain times, the special mineral makeup of the Sierra, the Vada granite, and the electromagnetic characteristics of the mist produced what she hypothesized might be natural radio time capsules. David's headlights abruptly illuminated something in front of him, and the taillights of another car filled him with relief as he realized he wasn't alone after the other vehicle appeared to know where it was going and kept a steady pace through the fog as he followed the red lights through it, keeping a safe distance and using them as a guide through the grey maze. However, as David followed the tail lights, he started to notice something strange about them. They had an odd shape and configuration that he was unable to identify any modern vehicles because they were round, widely spaced, and higher than modern car designs. The vehicle in front of him appeared to be from a bygone era, perhaps the 1950s or 1960s. After 20 more minutes of following the enigmatic vehicle, the fog abruptly started to clear, allowing David to see patches of his GPS instantly reconnected, displaying his position on Interstate 80 precisely where he expected to be. But the car he had been following was nowhere to be seen. Clear air ahead, and in a matter of seconds, he emerged from the fog bank entirely. The mountain air was crystal clear, and he could see stars overhead. David stopped at the next rest area and checked his fuel gauge. Despite driving through the fog for more than an hour, he had somehow used less fuel than expected, as if the time spent in the mist hadn't counted against his normal consumption. As evidenced by Morrison's research, the road ahead was completely empty, stretching into the clear night without any sign of taillights. Time itself appeared to behave differently within the fog formations, according to clock synchronization experiments using atomic timepieces. David made his drive to Reno without any more problems, but the experience was nonetheless memorable. There were multiple instances of temporal displacement within these fog banks, where drivers would enter the fog at one point and emerge hours later, but their vehicles' odometers and fuel gauges would show minimal usage. The area of Interstate 80 near Donner Pass was notorious among truckers and frequent travelers for these enigmatic fog banks that appeared without warning and seemed to exist outside of normal physical laws. The National Weather Service officially attributed the incidents to unusual, but the fog banks seemed to be windows into different times and places that were only accessible under certain conditions that happened only a few times. But David had read Morrison's declassified papers and knew there were aspects of the phenomenon that science couldn't fully account for. When driving through perfectly normal fog, David would occasionally remember the strange lights dancing in the mist, the impossible radio broadcasts, and the ghostly tail lights that had led him through a grey world where time itself seemed to bend and flow like the fog that contained it. Every year, however, he never took that route again. Every year, a few cars would be discovered abandoned on the side of the road close to Donner Pass. Their drivers would be nowhere to be seen, and the cars would be undamaged, with their headlights piercing the empty air and their engines still running. The fog would eventually claim them entirely, leaving only questions and the lingering feeling that some mysteries were best left unsolved. 5. The sleep trap of mile 247. When Rachel first saw the construction zone, orange cones and flashing lights appeared in her headlights, forcing her to leave the right lane on Interstate 40 through the Arizona desert. The digital sign said, "Roadwork." Rachel's eyelids were getting heavy. In order to reach her sister's house in Los Angeles, she had been traveling for 11 hours straight. Ahead, reduced speed in bright lead letters that cut through the 2:30 a.m. darkness. When she saw the construction zone, she felt a mixture of relief and annoyance, because the slower speed would at least lessen the risk if she dozed off, even if it meant arriving later than planned. Wedding Coffee had stopped working hours earlier, and she was battling the dangerous micro-sleeps that were becoming more frequent with each mile that went by. The construction zone seemed to stretch. Rachel's speedometer indicated that she was creeping along at only 25 kilometers per hour, stuck behind a queue of cars that had formed through the work zone. The monotonous pattern of orange reflectors led her through a winding path of lane changes and speed reductions for miles on end. And Rachel was unaware that she had come across one of the most hazardous phenomena in highway safety, the micro-sleep construction zone. Dr. James Patterson, a sleep researcher at the University of Arizona, had been examining this section of Interstate 40 for more than a year. The steady rhythm of her tires on the temporary pavement was hypnotic. 10 years of research showed that specific combinations of traffic flow, road geometry, and lighting patterns could produce what he called sleep traps, places where tired drivers were much more likely to nod off while driving. The construction zone on mile 247 had been there for 3 years, supposedly for a bridge repair project. However, the work zone seemed to be set up to maximize driver tiredness rather than ensure safety. According to Patterson's study, the lane designs drove drivers into a small, repetitive path with no visual variation, and the spacing of the construction lights generated a strobing effect. Rachel's head bobbed as she struggled to stay awake, the orange cones appearing to blend into an endless stream, and the white lines on the temporary pavement creating a hypnotic pattern that caused her eyes to water. She rolled down her windows, turned on the radio, and tried to avoid the effect that could cause micro-slumbers in already exhausted drivers. Rachel was using every tactic she knew to remain vigilant, but the construction zone appeared to be set up to induce a dangerous trance in drivers. The car in front of her had hazard lights that were blinking slowly, and she found herself paying attention to the rhythm of those lights as they flashed in perfect synchronization. The pattern was strange. The human brain, when extremely tired, would synchronize with repetitive visual stimuli, essentially using external rhythms to regulate neural activity. Construction zones with calming effects. She became alarmed when she noticed that her own eyelids were beginning to close in time with the blinking. Patterson's research, their consistent lighting and reflector patterns might unintentionally create the ideal environment for this risky synchronization. Rachel shook her head angrily in an attempt to break the spell, reaching for her phone to call anyone in order to stay vigilant and hear a human voice. but her phone displayed no signal because she was in one of those dead zones that plagued Rachel's GPS indicated that she was moving, but impossibly slowly, according to the display. She had been in the work zone for more than 90 minutes and had travelled less than 15 miles at this point. The construction zone continued for what seemed like hours, with remote parts of the interstate totally cut off from the outside world. Rachel started to notice other cars around her as she made her way through the maze of orange cones, most of which had their hazard lights on. She could also see drivers hunched over their steering wheels, seemingly asleep, and the entire convoy was crawling through the construction zone under the guidance of an unseen force. Rachel estimated that she would be stuck here until dawn. We're unaware that some construction companies were utilizing highway work zones as test sites for experimental traffic control systems, which used road geometry and subliminal lighting patterns to sway drivers, according to Dr. Patterson's classified research done in collaboration with the Federal Highway Administration. Behavior purportedly to enhance safety and traffic flow, but the experiments had gone awry. Rather than keeping drivers vigilant, the systems were causing mass hypnosis events in which entire groups of drivers would enter synchronized sleep states while retaining their fundamental motor skills. Their subconscious minds would then continue to function. There Rachel attempted to honk her horn to wake up the other drivers, but the sound seemed muffled and distant. The construction zone had an acoustic quality that absorbed sound, creating an unnaturally quiet environment despite the presence of dozens of vehicles. Vehicles followed the lighting instructions while their conscious minds shut down. The steady hum of engines running on autopilot and the rhythmic thrum of tires on pavement made her car feel perfectly balanced. The air conditioning seemed to be operating at an ideal temperature that she couldn't recall adjusting, and the radio was playing soothing instrumental music that she didn't recognize but found strangely reassuring. Her surroundings appeared to be set up to promote sleep, and Patterson's inquiry had turned up bills for neuro-influence systems and biometric monitoring devices that had been placed all over the construction zone. The workspace featured sensors that could measure. Rachel realized she was losing the fight against sleep when she found herself following the car ahead of her with no conscious memory of the last several minutes her hands were on the wheel. The system would then use the driver's heart rate, brain activity, and stress levels through their vehicle's electronics to adjust lighting, sound, and even electromagnetic fields to influence driver behavior. The orange cones appeared to pulse with their own light, now forming patterns that attracted her attention and kept it there. Her foot was on the gas pedal, but she had no memory of actively driving. Instead, she was acting on a pure subconscious reflex, guided by the hypnotic rhythm of the construction zone. The reflective strips on the road ahead appeared to bend and flow like water due to the mathematically arranged barriers, creating optical illusions. Rachel's conscious mind knew something was amiss, but her body would not obey her orders to stop or break free from the pattern, according to Dr. Patterson's final report, which was promptly designated as a mind control experiment by the Department of Transportation, which came to the conclusion that the Mile 247 construction zone was a fully functional mind control experiment that was cloaked as normal road construction. The technology was designed to be used in Rachel's last vivid memory is of seeing a green highway sign that said the construction zone was coming to an end. But when she checked her watch, it was 6:47 a.m. Autonomous car systems, but was being tested on unwitting human beings. She didn't remember anything after 2:30 a.m. for 4 hours. She entered the work area with her phone in hand, but her car was parked at a rest stop 60 miles outside the construction zone, and her petrol tank was almost empty. Had received numerous missed calls from family members concerned about her failure to check in during the night, but Rachel was unable to provide an explanation for her whereabouts or the events that transpired during those hours. When Rachel attempted to look up the construction project online, her GPS failed to record her travel through the construction zone, as if the road segment had not been recorded in the satellite data. Highway cameras showed a clear, unobstructed road with no construction activity, and the Arizona Department of Transportation had no permits issued for that location, so she could find no official records of any work being done on mile 247 of Interstate 40. However, other drivers had shared similar experiences, and online forums were replete with stories of people losing hours of time, while Rachel never drove that section of highway again, especially not at night, but occasionally when she was extremely exhausted. The patterns were always the same: orange cones, flashing lights, impossibly slow speeds, and memory lapses that left drivers confused and disoriented. These phantom construction zones seemed to exist only at night. The mile 247 construction zone had become a legend among long-distance drivers, a place where the road itself could reach into your mind. She would see orange construction lights in the distance while driving in the dark, feeling her eyelids getting heavy. The sleep trap was always waiting, ready to claim the next tired traveler who stumbled into its hypnotic embrace. It served as a reminder that, in the era of high technology, the biggest risks may not come from other motorists or mechanical issues, but rather from the road itself turning against its users. 6. The mirror anomaly of Route 66. It was 1:15 a.m. when Tom first realized anything was amiss while he was adjusting his rearview mirror. For the last 4 hours, he had been traveling east on the famed Route 66 through New Mexico. The desert roadway was deserted, save for his pickup truck slicing through the night. Yet as he looked, he noticed headlights following him in his mirror, which wasn't out of the ordinary because other drivers frequently traveled this route at night and occasionally ran into long-haul truckers or travelers. However, something about these headlights disturbed him because they never got closer or fell back no matter how much his speed changed. What was more unnerving was Tom was a geological surveyor who drove back to Oklahoma City after finishing a mineral assessment project near Flagstaff. He knew this section of Route 66 well, having driven it dozens of times for work. The road was straight and predictable through this section. The lights appeared somewhat familiar, but he couldn't place why. Tom was witnessing the start of a phenomenon that Dr. Maria Santos, a physicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, had been covertly observing. There were long sight lines across the desert floor, so there was nowhere for another vehicle to hide or play games, but the behavior of the following car seemed purposefully calculated. For more than 10 years, she studied what she called temporal reflection anomalies, which are situations where electromagnetic fields and atmospheric conditions can produce visual echoes of past events. The section of Route 66 through New Mexico had special characteristics that increased the likelihood of these anomalies happening. Large deposits of magnetite and other ferrous minerals from ancient volcanic activity were part of the area's geological makeup. When combined with the electromagnetic radiation over from decades of nuclear testing at nearby facilities, these elements could produce what Santos referred to as temporal mirrors. When Tom turned around and looked back through his rear window, he saw that the road was completely empty, but the headlights in his mirrors didn't match what he could see directly behind him. Tom tried to adjust his side mirrors to get a better look at the following vehicle, but the reflective surfaces in the atmosphere that could show images from different time periods made his blood run cold when he noticed that the headlights had stopped as well, maintaining their relative position behind him. He pulled over to the shoulder and waited for the other car to pass him. However, when he looked directly behind his truck, he saw nothing but empty asphalt that stretched into the darkness. Dr. Santos's classified research had recorded more than 300 similar incidents along this section of Route 66 during certain atmospheric conditions, such as clear, dry nights with little wind. When temperature inversions were likely to occur, drivers would report seeing cars in their mirrors that weren't actually there, sometimes 4 hours at a time. As soon as Tom started up his engine and re-entered the highway, the headlights in his mirrors started chasing after him. He tried a variety of speeds, slowing down to 30 kilometers per hour, and then speeding up to well over the speed limit. The mirror image matched his movements precisely, staying at the same distance the entire time. As he drove, Tom started to notice more details about the phantom car. The headlights had a unique shape and spacing that looked like they were from decades ago, and they were yellowish in tint instead of the bright white of contemporary LED or headlights. When he carefully angled his mirrors, he could see Santos's investigation had shown that many of the phantom vehicles reported by drivers matched the descriptions of cars that had traveled Route 66 during its heyday in the mid-century. The temporal mirrors appeared to be replaying the faint outline of what appeared to be a classic car from the 1960s or 1970s. The most unsettling part of Tom's experience was when he attempted to record the phenomenon in his smartphone. When he pointed the camera at his mirrors, it displayed an empty road. However, when he held the phone up to reveal his face while driving, he saw the enigmatic traffic patterns from decades ago that showed echoes of cars that had long since finished their journeys or been scrapped in junkyards. Tom's CB radio, which he kept for emergency communication in remote areas, suddenly came to life when a voice came through clearly breaker 1 to 19. This is Blue Moon running eastbound on what appeared to be headlights reflected in his eyes and mirrors that somehow showed him something that existed outside of normal visual perception. I can see you in my mirrors, but not right behind me. What's your 20? I'm about 4 miles back, good buddy, and I've been following you for the past hour. You're running at a good pace through this desert stretch. Tom looked in his mirrors and noticed the headlights, then turned to look directly behind him. The double nickel got a copy on that pickup truck before me. Tom grabbed the radio handset. I can see you clearly in my headlights. The blue pickup truck with the Oklahoma license plates. And you're right in front of me. Dr. Santos's research had shown multiple instances of cross-stereo communication where drivers in different time periods could communicate with each other. Tom attempted to understand what was going on by figuring out what year it was and where you were at another pause. The electromagnetic conditions that produce the visual echoes also appeared to allow radio waves to cross between different temporal states while they were experiencing the mirror anomaly. It was November 15, 2024, and Tom was somehow seeing and interacting with a driver from 51 years ago who was traveling the same route at the same time, but in a different decade. Hey buddy, it's 1973, November 15th, 1973. Why are you asking a question like that? I have a question for you, Blue Moon. Have you noticed anything odd about this section of road? If so, you should ask the driver. I've been seeing strange things in my mirrors tonight, like a modern truck ahead of me, but when I look with my eyes, nothing there. I reasoned that perhaps I was getting road fever. Santos's theoretical framework stated that drivers from various eras could simultaneously observe one another thanks to the temporal mirrors, each perceiving the other as an anomaly in their own timeline. The desert road had turned into a place where the past and present could overlap, and as Tom drove on, more voices joined the drivers from various decades were spotted in their mirrors as they traveled the same section of Route 66. For example, a truck driver from 1967 was transporting goods to California. A family from 1981 was taking a vacation in the Grand Canyon, and a young couple from 1959 was eloping to Las Vegas, claimed to have seen the others as spectral images in their mirrors, cars that came and went, sometimes solid, sometimes translucent, all traveling the same route, but decades apart, their paths overlapping in the electromagnetic anomaly that had transformed Route 66 into a temporal highway. The phenomenon lasted for precisely 100 kilometers, coming to an abrupt end just as abruptly as it had started. The CB radio went silent except for the occasional modern trucker communication as Tom left the affected area. The other drivers had gone back to their own time periods, and their brief intersection with the present was coming to an end. Tom later investigated the phenomenon and discovered Dr. Santos's the scientists hypothesized that, under certain circumstances, some places may turn into time streams where the past and present coexisted. According to declassified papers detailing the Route 66 temporal mirrors, the old roadway, with its decades of cumulative human experience and electromagnetic exposure, had become the highway held memories of everyone who had ever driven it, and under the right circumstances, those memories could reach across time to touch the present. He never forgot the experience of driving alongside the ghosts of Route 66's past. On clear desert nights, he would occasionally take that route again, in the hopes of catching a glimpse of the temporal travelers in his mirrors, reporting similar experiences, and Route 66 gained notoriety among physicists and paranormal investigators alike. The road had evolved into more than just painted lines and asphalt. It was a time machine masquerading as a highway, and the trip itself could take you not only across the country, but also across the world. Year 7, the engine frequency at precisely to 44 a.m. Lisa's automobile began to make noise. She was heading north. When she was traveling back to her home in Portland from a conference in San Francisco, Highway 101 through the California redwood forests, a barely noticeable humming sound coming from her engine soon escalated to the point where she had to pull over at the next turnout to check it out. She opened the hood and looked at the engine, using the flashlight on her phone, but everything appeared to be in order. The sound, which she could not identify as coming from any mechanical part, was more like a low-frequency tone that seemed to reverberate throughout the car, a harmonic vibration. When she returned to the car, the sound had completely stopped. Lisa was an acoustic engineer who specialized in she had extensive knowledge of all the sounds that automobile engines could produce, from the delicate whine of a failing alternator to the characteristic knock of bad fuel. But this particular sound was unique in her experience. It had a musical quality, almost like a sustained note played on. Dr. Robert Chen, a professor of mechanical engineering at Stanford University, had been secretly researching what he called resonance cascade event situations in which the natural frequency of a vehicle's engine could synchronize for more than 15 years. Lisa's encounter with some impossibly difficult instruments marked the start of this phenomenon. The stretch of Highway 101 through the redwood forests had special acoustic characteristics that increased the likelihood of these occurrences due to environmental factors that create hazardous feedback loops. The enormous trees created natural sound chambers, and the particular mineral composition of the soil and the electromagnetic fields produced by as Lisa continued to drive, the humming returned with greater intensity. This time, it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Not just the engine, but the entire car was vibrating in unison with some external force, making her steering wheel tremble. Subterranean water systems could influence mechanical vibrations in unexpected ways. And she sensed the vibration through the floorboards and seats. She attempted to change her speed in the hopes that the sound might be connected to the engine or PM, but the frequency stayed the same no matter how quickly she drove. The tone became louder and more insistent, producing an almost hypnotic effect that made it hard to focus on the road ahead. Dr. Chen's certain frequencies could have harmful psychological effects on drivers, according to classified research done in collaboration with several large automakers. For example, low-frequency vibrations may cause disorientation, anxiety, and even hallucinations by influencing the brain and inner ear. The sound was starting to interfere with Lisa's vision. The trees along the highway seemed to be swaying in time with the vibration, even though there was no wind, and the yellow lines on the road seemed to pulse. The automotive industry had worked to remove these frequencies from vehicle design, but environmental factors could occasionally reintroduce them, producing optical illusions that made it hard for her to stay in a lane. so she tightened her grip on the steering wheel to combat the dizziness. Her car radio began to pick up interference that matched the harmonic frequency of the engine, and the mechanical sound combined with the static created an unsettling symphony that filled the car's interior. She attempted turning Lisa, pulled over again, but this time the sound persisted even after turning off the radio. The car's electrical system was somehow enhancing the unexplained vibration, and even after turning off the engine, the vibration persisted through the speakers as though the car had turned into a tuning fork struck by something. Dr. Chen's research had shown that specific combinations of vehicle resonance, atmospheric pressure, and geological conditions could produce what he called invisible force. She exited the vehicle and proceeded to walk around it, but the sound seemed to follow her, creating a bubble of harmonic distortion that followed her through the forest. When Lisa attempted to restart her car, the engine responded to the harmonic frequency rather than her throttle input, causing the EPMs to rise and fall. This type of mechanical possession, in which a vehicle's systems would continue to operate according to external frequencies rather than driver input, was especially dangerous because it could override normal mechanical controls, sync with the enigmatic vibration, producing a rhythm that seemed almost alive. The car wanted to drive itself by obeying the frequency's instructions instead of her steering and acceleration, but she had to exert constant effort to stop it from doing so. When the frequency peaked, the car would accelerate on its own. The forest around her appeared to be reacting to the same frequency as it faded, causing a dangerous oscillation in speed that made driving extremely dangerous. Trees swayed in unison, their massive trunks moving like tuning forks, and despite the still air, small animals emerged from the underbrush and started to move in unison, as though the vibration was forcing them to dance to its beat. Lisa came to understand that the frequency was impacting not only her vehicle, but the entire ecosystem. Birds flew in formation overhead, their flight patterns matching the harmonic oscillations, and even the fog that moved in waves between the trees matched the amplitude of the sound. Redwood trees, with their distinct acoustic and electromagnetic qualities, could amplify and sustain these frequencies for hours or more. Dr. Chen's study has identified this as a resonance field, an area where a given frequency might affect many systems concurrently. The frequency was attempting to synchronize her biological systems, drawing her into its hypnotic influence. Even days later, under the correct circumstances, the psychological effects were getting worse. Lisa found herself unconsciously tapping her fingers on the steering wheel with the vibration. Her breathing synchronized with the rhythm, and she had to consciously force herself to break the pattern. As Lisa drove farther into the resonance field, her phone started acting strangely, with apps opening and closing in patterns that matched the harmonic frequency. The device's speakers joined the chorus, adding electronic tones to the mechanical symphony, and even her digital watch was beeping in time with the enigmatic vibration. The drivers appeared to be in a trance-like state, unable or unwilling to escape the harmonic influence that some vehicles were driving themselves in. They were parked along the roadside with their engines running, and their owners were standing next to them, their faces blank, swaying slightly in time with the frequency. Dr. Chen's classified files included reports of complete traffic jams, brought on by the cars moving in synchronized patterns down the highway in a mechanical parade, their drivers either unconscious or completely absent. The car's headlights pulsed in unison, creating strobing patterns that added visual elements to the acoustic phenomenon. When the frequency took over, dozens of cars would become stuck in harmonic feedback loops, making it impossible for the drivers to drive normally and forcing them to become passengers in their own cars. Lisa knew she needed to get out of the resonance field before she lost all control, so she concentrated all of her strength on doing so. The frequency resisted, growing more intense and adding new harmonic layers that created resistance. It was like swimming against a strong current, requiring constant mental effort to keep her independent. The harmonic influence forced her to drive in patterns that contradicted the frequency. Even more challenging was the fact that her car trembled and vibrated as opposing forces fought for control of her conscious will against the environmental resonance that sought to take possession of her vehicle. After what seemed like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes, Lisa eventually left the affected area, and the harmonic frequency gradually decreased like a radio station was out of range, so she pulled over at the first rest area, called Dr. Chen, whose research she had come across during her graduate studies, and he listened to her story with great concern, explaining that she had witnessed one of the worst resonance cascade events ever recorded. The phenomenon only happened in certain circumstances, typically when specific vehicle types, atmospheric pressure systems, and driver psychological states were present. The automotive industry had been covertly researching these occurrences for years. New safety procedures for Highway 101, including warning systems that could identify hazardous frequency accumulations and notify drivers to avoid impacted areas, were developed in response to Lisa's experience in order to prevent vehicles from falling under harmonic influence. However, the resonance fields persisted in appearing erratically, transforming the tranquil redwood forests into acoustic. She drove that section of highway alone again, because of the minefields, where cars could turn into instruments in an unearthly symphony. At night, in particular, the memory of her car singing in unison with unseen forces haunted her, serving as a reminder that even the most familiar technology could turn strange when exposed to the correct frequency. The memory road of Interstate 75. Dr. Amanda Walsh initially became aware of the memory gaps while driving from Atlanta to Atlanta, when she learned that the line separating driver and machine was thinner than most people imagined, around mile marker 180 in Tennessee. She realized she couldn't recall the last 30 minutes of driving. It was 3:15 a.m. She was heading to Detroit to deliver her study on brain trauma at a medical conference. This was a regular trip she had taken dozens of times before. When she looked at her dashboard clock, she could have sworn it was 2:45. Her car was traveling at highway speed in the right lane, and she felt awake and focused, but she had no memory of the previous 30 minutes. The last thing she could recall distinctly was passing through Chattanooga, but her GPS indicated that she was now well into central Tennessee. Amanda, a neurologist who specialized in memory disorders, was aware that her momentary amnesia while driving could be a sign of anything from a minor seizure to a serious neurological event, so she pulled over at the next rest area to Dr. Walsh, evaluated her condition, but all of her brain functions were normal. However, she had reached a zone that Vanderbilt University cognitive neuroscientist Dr. Marcus Thompson had been surreptitiously researching for more than 10 years. Thompson's research was centered on what he called under certain circumstances. A section of Interstate 75 through central Tennessee has been the scene of hundreds of reported memory incidents over the past 20 years. This phenomenon is known as highway-induced dissociative episodes, and it occurs when drivers experience temporary memory loss, would reach their destinations without remembering important parts of their trip, even though they continued to drive normally during the affected period. This phenomenon was most prevalent in the late hours of the night, and mainly affected people with specific neurological profiles. As Amanda attempted to piece together what had happened, she checked her phone for any her car's trip computer displayed the expected mileage, and there were no indications of erratic driving or stops, so she was unable to account for any calls or messages she might have made during the missing time. It seemed as though 30 minutes had just vanished from her memory. She started driving again with the intention of closely monitoring her mental state, but within 20 minutes it happened. Once more, this time, she lost almost 45 minutes. Dr. Thompson's classified research, carried out in collaboration with the Federal Highway Administration, had identified specific environmental factors. 1 minute, she was passing a truck near mile marker 200 and the next. She was approaching Nashville without remembering the distance, a state he called automotive dissociation, a type of highway hypnosis so intense that it inhibited memory formation, could be brought on by the elevation changes of the highway, specific lighting conditions, and the hypnotic rhythm of mile markers. This phenomenon was linked to the brains under normal conditions. Drivers would maintain some awareness of their actions, but certain autopilot systems may effectively shut down the conscious mind, while the subconscious continued to safely control the car during typical repetitive tasks like highway driving. Amanda tried everything she could think of to keep herself conscious, including turning on the radio, opening the windows, and even talking to herself aloud. But the episodes kept happening more frequently, and she would wake up to find herself miles away. Environmental triggers could cause this dissociation to reach pathological levels. The most unsettling thing was that, despite having no recollection of how she got there, her driving during these episodes seemed to be completely normal. Thompson had obtained security camera footage from highway monitoring systems through his government research, which demonstrated that drivers going through memory episodes maintained the appropriate speed, complied with traffic regulations, and even changed lanes appropriately to avoid slower cars during her fourth memory loss. But when she came to, Amanda discovered handwritten notes on the passenger seat that seemed to be in her own handwriting. The notes contained the notes, which were written in her unique medical notation style, complete with the abbreviations and terminology she used in her clinical practice, contained detailed observations about her neurological state, heart rate, and driving conditions, but she had no memory of recording them. It was as though her subconscious mind had taken over entirely, not just driving the vehicle, while also performing a medical self-assessment. Similar instances of unconscious documentation were reported by Thompson's research, in which drivers would carry out difficult tasks during memory episodes, such as making phone calls, sending texts, or even stopping for gas, without conscious memory of these actions. Amanda's medical training advised her to stop and seek assistance, but she felt compelled to keep driving, despite the fact that her mind seemed capable of far more complex behavior than was previously recognized. Her notes, which she had reportedly written, encouraged her to keep going and record the experience for future research. It seemed as though her professional curiosity was driving her, was overriding her instincts for survival, and as she proceeded through the affected area, the memory lapses became more frequent, but also more detailed in their unconscious documentation. When she would regain consciousness, she would discover detailed notes about the state of the highway, other cars, and even intricate neurological theories about what might the handwriting stayed the same. But the content became more complex, with diagrams of brain structures and theories regarding the phenomenon that her unconscious mind appeared to be conducting in real time while treating her own condition as a case study worth recording. According to Dr. Thompson's research on the neurological mechanisms, the Interstate 75 phenomenon mainly impacted people with particular cognitive profiles, typically highly educated professionals whose minds were used to compartmentalizing information, and functioning on multiple levels of the highway itself seemed to act as a trigger for these people's innate tendency toward dissociation. The combination of repetitive visual stimuli, constant road noise, and the automatic nature of highway driving could push their brains into a state where conscious awareness became especially noticeable for medical professionals, researchers, and engineers. Amanda's most severe memory loss, which lasted more than 2 hours and reportedly involved her driving from Nashville to the Kentucky border, left her very disoriented. When she recovered consciousness, she discovered a thorough research proposal on the passenger seat, replete with methodology hypothesis, and the proposal described a thorough investigation of highway-induced dissociative episodes, including suggestions for neurological monitoring equipment and suggested cooperation with transportation authorities. The literature review was expertly written and scientifically sound, but she had no recollection of writing it. It was the kind of document that would take her. The proposal was sent to Dr. Marcus Thompson at Vanderbilt University, a researcher she had never heard of before this trip, and it took hours to compose under normal conditions, but it seemed to have been formed by her unconscious mind while driving. When Amanda finally got off Interstate 75 in Kentucky, the memory episodes stopped right away. She drove the rest of the way to Detroit with complete awareness and normal memory formation, but the experience had drastically altered her perception as she later contacted Dr. Thompson, whose research she learned about from the proposal her unconscious mind had written, and he explained that she had suffered from one of the worst cases of highway-induced dissociation ever recorded. She also discussed consciousness and the possibility that the human mind can function on multiple levels simultaneously. Documentation shed important light on the phenomenon. According to Thompson's theory, some people were born with the capacity to sustain multiple streams of consciousness, and certain environmental stimuli could involuntarily activate this capacity. The highway thus turned into a laboratory where the unconscious mind could function. Amanda's experience raised troubling questions about the nature of consciousness and free will. If her unconscious mind could act independently while the conscious mind stayed offline. However, it also prompted new research into the therapeutic potential of controlled dissociative states for treating trauma and memory disorders, conduct studies, make choices, and even plan future actions without her knowledge. What did that say about human autonomy? She never drove Interstate 75 by herself again, especially at night, because the memory road had revealed to her hitherto unknown layers of thought. An unofficial network of researchers studying their own dissociative episodes developed on that section of highway. The other medical professionals started reporting similar experiences, making the road an unintentional laboratory for consciousness research where the journey took place. The knowledge that environmental factors could take over her consciousness was more terrifying than any physical danger she had ever encountered. 9. The gravity wells of Highway 285. Engineer Carlos Martinez saw his car slow down without applying the brakes, revealing hidden facets of the human psyche that were better left unexplored. Was 2:37 a.m. He was returning from a construction site inspection close to Denver when he was traveling south on Highway 285 through the San Luis Valley in Colorado. His cruise control was set at precisely 110 kilometers per hour, but his speedometer was. Carlos, who worked for the Colorado Department of Transportation and had driven this route hundreds of times over the course of his 15-year career, knew every curve, grade, and feature of this stretch of highway. Despite the flat terrain and lack of wind resistance, the vehicle was steadily declining. What was happening to his vehicle defied everything he understood. Carlos noticed something even more unsettling in his car as his speed continued to drop without any mechanical reason. His coffee cup was empty, his change was missing, and his phone was sliding toward the front of the car as though it were climbing a steep hill. But his GPS and the perfectly normal straight road ahead, he was traveling over perfectly level terrain. What Carlos was experiencing was the start of a phenomenon that Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a University of Colorado gravitational physicist, had been covertly studying for more than 8 years. Her research was centered on what she called the San Luis Valley's distinct geological structure increased the likelihood of localized gravitational anomalies, which are regions where the Earth's gravitational field shows unexplained variations that could affect moving objects. The valley floor sits atop a complex network of underground caverns and mineral deposits left behind. Carlos pulled over and checked his engine, but everything seemed normal. The temperature was fine. The oil level was fine because of the gravitational irregularities caused by ancient volcanic activity deep beneath the surface by dense concentrations of metallic ores. His car struggled to maintain speed when he tried to accelerate back onto the highway, even though the gauge was showing optimal readings and his dashboard was free of warning lights. He was an experienced automotive engineer. and knew that a number of things could cause power loss, including clogged air filters, fuel system issues, and pulling a heavy trailer, transmission problems. But his diagnostic tools revealed that everything was operating as it should. The car was mechanically flawless, but it acted as though there was an unseen force at work. Dr. Rodriguez's classified research, carried out in collaboration with NASA's Gravitational Research Division, had recorded more than 200 instances of this kind. Drivers on Highway 285 would frequently describe experiencing abrupt power outages, objects moving inexplicably within their cars, and the feeling that they were traveling uphill or a perfectly level road. This phenomenon was especially prevalent under certain meteorological circumstances where fluctuations in barometric pressure may. As Carlos drove, the gravitational effects grew stronger, causing his fuel gauge to show consumption rates 3 times higher than usual. It felt like his engine was working against a lot of resistance, and even simple movements required more effort. It was as though gravity itself was at work, had grown in this particular area. But the most disturbing part was the impact on his inner ear and balance. Carlos started to experience symptoms of vertigo and disorientation that were typical of altered gravitational fields because his body was used to Earth's normal gravitational pull, and the changes he was going through were causing his Dr. Rodriguez's coffee spilled upward, defying normal physics, as droplets hung suspended in the air before slowly falling back down. His toolbox in the back seat slid forward and backward in patterns that seemed to correspond with invisible waves of gravitational force. Biological warning systems objects that should have remained stationary started moving with apparent purpose. These gravity wells could produce transient zones of increased or decreased gravitational pull that could affect everything from human physiology to vehicle performance. Carlos's speedometer continued to fluctuate after research showed that the gravitational anomalies followed predictable patterns occurring in waves that moved across the valley floor at regular intervals. His GPS started to malfunction, showing his position jumping erratically across the road, and his car would suddenly surge forward as if released from some invisible constraint. The roller coaster effect of the gravitational waves made normal driving all but impossible. The most peculiar effect occurred when Carlos came across a car moving in the opposite direction from his own. The satellite navigation system depended on exact timing signals that could be impacted by gravitational time dilation. The anomalous gravitational fields were warping spacetime enough to confuse the satellite receivers. As the two cars got closer, it seemed like an unseen force was pulling them toward one another. Carlos had to struggle to keep his lane, and the other driver seemed to be having the same problem. Dr. Rodriguez's research had shown that this gravitational lensing effect could produce attractive forces between moving objects. Although it was happening on a much smaller scale within Earth's gravitational field, the phenomenon was comparable to how massive celestial bodies could bend light and affect nearby objects. Carlos attempted to report the incident using his radio, but the electromagnetic interference from the gravitational distortions was interfering with communication, and his radio picked up odd signals. He had never heard anything like that. Deep resonant tones that seemed to emanate from the Earth itself. They rose and fell in patterns that matched the gravitational effects he was experiencing, and it sounded like the gravitational waves themselves transformed into audio frequencies. It was as though the planet was singing its voice audibly. Only, in the anomalous zones, as Carlos continued into the impacted area, he came across other drivers who had stopped and were standing next to their cars, appearing bewildered and disoriented. Some were conducting spontaneous experiments, dropping objects and observing the odd patterns they formed, while others were just gazing up at the sky. Dr. Rodriguez's field observations revealed a tendency for people to congregate in anomalous zones and carry out informal scientific experiments in an attempt to comprehend why the well-known laws of physics had abruptly changed. This tendency was driven by people's natural desire to comprehend and classify unusual phenomena. which led them to push the limits of the gravitational waves started to alter Carlos's perception of time, making his dashboard clock appear to be running slowly in comparison to his watch. This relativistic effect happened when gravitational fields deviated significantly from Earth's normal minutes. It seemed like hours passed while he battled to drive through the warped spacetime, and his car's electronic systems began to malfunction. In ways unrelated to mechanical breakdown, the engine was running inefficiently because the gravitational time dilation was affecting the timing of the fuel injection. Carlos realized that he was seeing physics that most people would never see outside of extreme environments like black holes or neutron stars. The San Luis Valley had somehow turned into a gravitational research laboratory where Einstein's theories were tested. Even his headlights appeared to be dimmed, as if the photons were being bent away from their intended path, played out on a human scale. And after what seemed like hours, but was probably only 90 minutes, Carlos finally came out of the anomalous zone. The strange gravitational effects stopped as suddenly as they had started, and all that remained of his impossible journey through distorted spacetime was the memory of it. His car's performance instantly returned to normal. Later, he got in touch with Dr. Rodriguez, whose work he had read about in scientific journals. She told him that he had witnessed one of the worst gravitational anomaly events ever documented by a civilian, and that his thorough engineering observations had given him important information about how these phenomena affected mechanical systems. The Colorado Department of Transportation had blamed the accidents on bad weather and tired drivers, but Carlos understood that what he had witnessed was much beyond the realm of common sense. The highway had turned into a window into the basic forces that shaped reality. Carlos started carrying specialized equipment on his drives through the valley to record gravitational variations and their effects on vehicle performance. After discovering that even gravity could be unreliable, his reports added to the increasing amount of scientific evidence that the Earth's gravitational field was far more complex and variable than most people realized. Physicists and engineers who were aware of the implications of the Highway 285 gravity wells kept them a secret. The road had shown that the most fundamental force in the universe could be just as dangerous and unpredictable as any human threat, transforming a routine drive into a voyage through space. It was 1:52 when Sarah Chen, a pilot in Highway 2's magnetic dead zone, noticed that her compass was spinning erratically while she was traveling east in a rental car through northern Montana on her way to a flight training conference in Minneapolis. Sarah always carried numerous navigation tools since, as a commercial airline pilot, her training taught her to never rely on a single system. When her phone's GPS stopped working, she was using her backup compass to navigate after her GPS unexpectedly lost signal near the Canadian border. When that didn't work, she went to her handheld GPS unit. When that didn't work either, she took out her magnetic compass, but now even that most dependable of tools was acting strangely. The compass needle went in lazy circles, stopping occasionally to point in random directions that weren't related to magnetic north. As a pilot, Sarah knew that the phenomenon that Sarah had experienced was one that Dr. Michael Hartman, a geophysicist at the University of Montana, had observed. She had never seen a compass completely lose its bearings like this. The device was practically useless, leaving her to navigate by dead reckoning and the occasional highway sign. Had spent more than 10 years researching what he called magnetic null zones, regions where the Earth's magnetic field showed extreme distortions that could make navigational devices totally unreliable. The Great Falls were directly above the northern Montana section of Highway 2. Massive deposits of magnetite and other magnetic minerals were found in the tectonic zone, an area where ancient geological forces had formed unusual mineral formations deep underground. Under certain circumstances, these formations could interfere with Earth's normal magnetic field, which is what Sarah's car started experiencing. Electrical issues as she proceeded through the impacted area Her headlights rhythmically dimmed and brightened, her radio produced only static on all frequencies, and her dashboard instruments fluctuated wildly. Her speedometer displayed readings that obviously didn't match her actual speed, and the fuel gauge jumped between empty and full. Speed. She stopped to inspect her car, but upon visual inspection, nothing was clearly amiss. The alternator belt was tight, the battery terminals were clean, and all the fuses seemed to be in good condition, but her car's entire electrical system was acting as though it was being exposed to strong electromagnetic fields. The magnetic anomalies were powerful enough to interfere with aircraft navigation systems, causing commercial flights to steer clear of specific flight paths over northern Montana during periods of high activity. According to Dr. Hartman's classified research done in collaboration with the Federal Aviation Administration, which documented hundreds of similar incidents in this area, Sarah continued. While driving, she observed that other cars and trucks were having similar issues. They were pulled over with their hazard lights blinking erratically, and she could see drivers standing next to their cars, holding their cell phones high in the air in a desperate attempt to receive a signal. Dr. Hartman described these magnetic disturbances as creating an electromagnetic dead zone where cell towers, GPS satellites, and even radio broadcasts couldn't pass through the magnetic interference created by the subterranean mineral formations. Sarah's pilot training had taught her how to use a magnetic compass for navigation, but the abilities she possessed, the most unsettling part of the phenomenon, was how it affected her car's engine management system, which is what modern vehicles rely on. She had to use celestial navigation, which used the positions of stars to maintain her eastbound heading, because her knowledge of aircraft didn't translate well to ground navigation. Dr. Hartman's investigation had shown that the magnetic disturbances followed predictable patterns occurring in waves that moved across the landscape at the same time. Her engine started running roughly as if the electromagnetic interference was affecting the timing of the fuel injection. She was relying heavily on electronic sensors and computer controls, all of which were being disrupted by the magnetic anomalies. Sarah came upon a convoy of stranded vehicles close to mile marker 127, where truckers, their families, and other travelers had gathered to share information. These magnetic storms could occur at regular intervals and last anywhere from a few minutes to several hours, trapping travelers in places where electronic technology was practically useless. A seasoned trucker named Jake explained that the phenomenon happened multiple times per month, usually during particular weather conditions when atmospheric pressure could amplify the underground magnetic fields. The informal community had developed its own strategies for dealing with the magnetic anomalies while waiting for their electronic systems to return to normal. The aurora borealis, which is typically only visible much further north, was dancing across the Montana sky in a way that Sarah had never seen before, thanks to the magnetic field distortions created by seasoned drivers who frequently traveled this route, carried backup mechanical instruments, and knew how to navigate using landmarks and dead reckoning. Her watch, which was mechanical rather than electronic, continued to work normally, but time seemed to move differently within the magnetic dead zone. Other travelers reported similar phenomena. The magnetic anomalies were channeling charged particles from the solar wind, creating brilliant green and blue curtains that shouldn't have been visible at this latitude. Dr. Hartman's research had identified this as a psychological effect of prolonged electromagnetic exposure. The human brain, which operated on bioelectrical impulses, could be influenced by strong magnetic fields in ways that caused temporal distortions, as if the electromagnetic fields were somehow altering their perception of time passing. The magnetic fields were apparently powerful enough to affect brain function, causing a type of electromagnetic-induced hypoxia that left Sarah feeling disoriented and cut off from her surroundings. This affected her perception, memory, and even emotional state. Sarah started to experience mild disorientation and memory gaps, similar to what she had experienced during high-altitude flights. As she waited with the other stranded travelers, Sarah noticed that the local wildlife was acting strangely. Her mechanical wristwatch had become her only trustworthy tool, but even that seemed to be operating slower than usual. The magnetic fields were somehow affecting the metal components of the timepiece, causing tiny distortions that added up to noticeable timing errors. The anomaly peaked at 4:30 a.m. when birds flew in odd patterns, seemingly unable to use their natural magnetic navigation systems. Herds of migratory birds, who typically traveled in straight lines, were drifting in circles, as perplexed by the magnetic abnormalities as the human travelers. Sarah's rental automobile perished when the magnetic disturbances got so bad that even mechanical equipment were impacted. The magnetic fields caused electrical currents to flow through the metal parts, interfering with ignition systems, and the car engines halted completely. Because even their headlights failed, the visitors were left stuck in total darkness with dozens of other vehicles. The only source of illumination was the unusual aurora overhead, which projected an odd green glow across the countryside, making everything appear alien. Strange Dr. Hartman's emergency procedures required visitors to stay in their automobiles during periods of high magnetic activity, since the metal frames offered some defense against electromagnetic impacts. But the feeling of being confined in it was mentally traumatizing to see a lifeless automobile with odd lights dancing overhead. Around 6:15 a.m., the magnetic storm eventually started to weaken for a lot of folks. All electrical systems progressively resumed their regular operations, including Sarah's GPS. Her car's engine management and magnetic north were detected when she reconnected her compass. When the system started functioning normally again, the aurora dimmed as the sun rose. Just the recollection of an incredible night. She later got in touch with Dr. Hartman, whose he clarified that she found the information through aviation safety bulletins, has gone through one of the worst magnetic anomaly occurrences ever documented in field intensities in the vicinity of the magnetic poles are comparable to those observed in the Federal Aviation commercial flights, had been discreetly moved by the administration to avoid the impacted area, while ground transportation officials were hesitant to recognize the phenomena or alert drivers to the possible risks. The government organizations wanted to maintain magnetic dead zones because they posed a serious safety risk. Sarah's experience with classified led to additional studies on the impact of magnetic anomalies on contemporary transit networks as society grew more reliant on Highway 2 and other electronic navigation and communication areas represented expanding. She didn't drive across northern Montana because of the dangers to technological civilization, once more without carrying a lot of emergency supplies and backup navigation equipment. She learned from the magnetic dead zone that in a time when people are dependent on electronics, modern technology could still be totally destroyed by old geological processes, pointless, transforming a normal commute into a trip back to the days before electronic pages.